Hey, so this is Hussein Omar, and I interviewed my dad. It's been something I wanted to do for a while, partly because of just the climate in the country right now, but then also just to learn also about my like my family history and my mom and my dad. My dad pioneered to Chile, as he'll explain. He pioneered to Chile, and that's where he met my mom. My mom was from Chile, and she's passed away now, about 15 years. But I wanted to talk with him and hear about the stories of kind of like what life was like before I was born, and particularly during the coup and after the coup in Chile that took place, the U.S. backed coup, and how the Baha'i community managed that transition and the climate in the country at the time. So I found it really interesting, and I hope you will too.
So by this time, the U.S. was already involved.
It had been, it was a very it was a very difficult time. Food was scarce. You couldn't get milk, you couldn't get cheese, you couldn't get beef. There was a black market when we got there. It was 39 escudos, the local currency, to the dollar, the official rate. The black market was 250 to 300 to 500 per dollar. Inflation reached a level of several thousand% a year at one point. Um, People would, the large stores, for instance, in the big cities would close at, say, 10 o'clock at night. And people would already be lining up outside with blankets on the sidewalks, and they would wait all night with string bags in their hands so that they could be the first in the store the next morning to see whatever had come in overnight. So it was powdered milk and formula, it was sugar, it was flour. Toilet paper was a big thing. There was a black market in toilet paper. If you knew somebody who worked at the toilet paper factory, you could kind of write your own ticket because you could trade toilet paper for food. It was it was pretty horrific. And as a Baha'i pioneer, at that point, I was living in a small town in the south of, about 3 hours south of the capital. It was the same thing. I was finally changing my money on the black market so I could buy what little food there was. So once a week, I would go to the government-run hotel in town and have a piece of beef for lunch and maybe some potatoes and maybe some coffee. A lot of people would get on the trains and ride 2 or 3 cities down so they could have lunch on the dining car and then ride back on the next train going the opposite direction because the government had its hands on all the food. So there was no beef to be had unless it was in a restaurant or an agency of the government. So this, obviously this was getting to people. It was very difficult. People's money wasn't worth anything. It wasn't quite as bad as Germany right between the two world wars, but it wasn't far off from that. Social tensions were rising. Families were split apart by people who thought Allende was doing the right thing and people who thought he wasn't. The Baha'is had to try to manage that situation in some way. When Allende was elected, they reached out to him, as Baha'is do everywhere, to make the acquaintance of the head of state and to make sure that they're informed about who the Baha'is are and what their hopes are for society. And Allende kind of didn't give the Baha'is the time of day. He had an aide send back a piece of a note he'd written in pencil on a piece of paper that he'd torn out of a notepad. They had given him a book called The Proclamation of Baha'u'llah, so he basically wrote back and said, "Thanks for the book, Salvador." And that was it.
Did you see that?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, that had happened before I got there.
Okay.
And so, because Baha'is are supposed to be loyal to the legitimately elected government of the country in which they live, it became increasingly difficult even for the Baha'is to know where they were standing, because as I mentioned before, there was no neutral ground. Everybody was being forced to take sides. People had to sign up for the Socialist or the Communist Party in order to have work. So your mother, my wife, had to choose how she was going to manage that, and she held out for a long time. In her case, her skill as a teacher actually bought her a little bit of space. They didn't push her on signing up for a party because she said she would have trouble doing that, and they didn't want to lose her as a teacher, so they kind of looked the other way, which was pretty amazing.
And then eventually she had to, or?
No, then coup happened, and it now became a moot point. But there were Baha'is who said, you guys think that you're being nice to Allende, but what are you going to do if you wake up one day and he's not there anymore? He can make the military do whatever he wants, so he can change our society, and you just have to, what do you think about that? It was very difficult, and there were messages from the World Center, at least carried informally, verbal messages saying, hang in there. Chile has a great destiny, and this will all work out. So the Baha'is did the best they could. There were a few who lost their administrative rights because they had become active in party politics on one side or the other. It was a very difficult time, very hard to know where to stand and how to think about what was going on.
What did teaching the faith look like in that environment?
So you went out and you did your best. I think all of a sudden, I can't remember if it was before or after the coup. Yeah, the teaching event I'm thinking about actually happened after the coup, so never mind. Before that time, there was a group that went down to Punta Arenas, which is way in the south of the continent. And it's a beautiful kind of European city. And there were 12, maybe 15 young Baha'is and a couple of adults to ride herd on us. And our job was to invite people to public meetings. So we went out around the streets, handing out leaflets and inviting people to meetings at the town hall in the middle of the city. And we had a pretty good reception. People were interested in hearing about the Baha'is. They thought that your mother, who was wearing a red scarf around her neck, must be a representative of the Communist Party. So she got that a lot. We laughed about it a lot. She and I were always assigned to go together to knock on these doors, so we had a chance to get to know each other. That was kind of fun. But so things went on that way for about a year. I had been living in the back room of a house that had been turned into a school, and at night I used a little hot plate that I had found to make dinner for myself. So if I had a little rice, I'd boil some rice. And if I'd been really lucky, the store down the street had gotten in some cheese or maybe a tomato, so I'd slice those and put them on top of the rice, and that would be my dinner. Um, Occasionally, I even entertained visitors. Some Baha'is occasionally would stop by and spend the night. We had 2 army surplus cots. So one of them was Sergio Aparicio. He spent the night, and I made for him the dinner that I had. He was a little bit freaked out. But
This is Kilpue.
that was in a town called Curicó, which is a provincial capital south of the country. And there would be riots often in the streets. One favorite route for the demonstrators was to go right outside the place where I worked, which was the Chilean North American Institute. It was affiliated loosely with the U.S. Embassy, so it was a target for the communists who were marching. So one of my students, an Adventist missionary, said, "Why don't you come live with us? Get out of the town center. You can live with us. We'll give you food. And if anything happens to this building," because things were getting increasingly violent, demonstrations were getting increasingly violent, "if anything happens to this building, they won't find you alone in it." So that seemed like a good idea. I was on the National Teaching Committee at the time, and one of the counselors said, "Well, you have to have maps of the country. You have to be able to figure out where you're going and where you want to send people." So my job was to get maps. So I arrived early one Friday for a weekend meeting, and I knew where the Map Institute was. The Air Force they were in charge of mapping the country, and so they had a retail outlet in the middle of the city. When I got there, there was a demonstration raging through the streets, and so everywhere I went to try to get to this map office, there were demonstrators. And the police came in with what they called guanacos, which were big water cannons. And they were using them and tear gas to disperse or herd the demonstrators in different ways. But violence had broken out. There were no shots fired, but I could see from a distance, I could see the police and the army beating the rioters up with sticks and stuff. And there were armed people there. I finally went to a park that was on a rise, a sort of a rock that stuck up in the middle of the city, to see if I could see a clear route to get to where I was going. And when I got to the top of this thing, I was going towards the balustrade where I could look down into that part of the city, and tear gas grenades started coming up over the fence. And guys that I later realized were communists were also climbing up over the fence. I remember one of them had about a 4-foot bicycle chain welded to a handle that he had in his hand, and he was swinging it around his head and using it literally to slice people, cut people around him. So these were not nice people. It was a very violent thing. I finally found a way around. And I was in the map agency, the map store, which was all glass, floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out on the main boulevard of town, which was full of struggling demonstrators. I swear this demonstration just went wherever I went. And all of a sudden, a guy goes running by. Some shots rang out. So the salesman said, "Why don't we get into the closet?" And I said, "That sounds like a good idea." So we were inside the closet in this fishbowl of a store when a young guy goes running by. He sort of breaks out of the crowd, and then a hand comes out of the crowd and grabs his long blonde hair, and his feet went out from under him, and he went up in the air, horizontal to the ground, and then fell to the sidewalk. So the wind was knocked out of him. And now a struggle ensued right outside this store because one group of people wanted to take him upstairs to get him looked after, and another group of people said, "No, you're from the right and he's from the left, and if you take him up there, we know you're going to kill him, so we're not going to let you do that." The police eventually arrived, and using their clubs and something that looked a lot like cattle prods, they restored order and cleared the plaza. So I bought my maps and went on to the meeting. But that was kind of what it was like to live then.
So at this point, had Allende and the military split? Like, so these were Allende supporters rioting against the military? Or?
There was no public split. No, it was just that everything had become so polarized that it was a powder keg just sort of waiting to blow up. And again, we later learned as things came out that the two extremes of the political spectrum had been arming themselves. The government had been caching rifles and handheld rockets, anti-tank rockets, in various public buildings because they expected that the military was going to make a move. They used those things when the coup finally came. So when the coup came, it was a shock. As much as people had been expecting that the military would step in, as they had done before in Chilean history, some people began saying, this isn't going to work until the military steps in. So I was walking to my job one morning and hitchhiking, because the fellow who took me in lived about 3 miles away from the school. And a guy picked me up and he said, "Well, we're all set." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, they're bombing the presidential palace. So this is getting taken care of right now." So I went to the school, but then word came around that there was going to be a curfew, and everybody had to get back home. So I went back to where I lived, and we listened to the radio for the rest of the day. There was no TV coverage of any of this. And we heard the announcement from the new military junta. We've taken over. We're imposing order on the country. President Allende has been killed.
Oh, they announced that?
Yeah.
Did you hear Allende's last broadcast? Or?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it was it was kind of surreal. So, we hunkered down. There was a curfew for 3 days. You couldn't go out at all. And the military had orders to shoot on sight, which they did.
Even in the small towns?
Yeah. At night, you could hear pitched gun battles all over the city, with explosions and automatic and machine gunfire and so on. So you knew that people were getting killed that night.
Who was fighting?
It was the army who was moving into the low-income neighborhoods and the slums where Allende's base of support was, and they were rounding people up, taking them away. Anybody who'd ever had anything to do with politics. So the curfew was lifted gradually, and it might have been the 4th day or so. People were allowed to go out for an hour to grocery shop, and then they had to be back at home. There was military march music on the radio all day, every day. It was really amazing. It was kind of it's sort of the thing that our government used later to drive Noriega out of his compound in Panama. It was crazy making. And lots of rumors. The phones were taken down on the day of the coup, but they came back, so people were trying to call family. Your mother didn't have a phone, so I couldn't call her. I had no idea what was happening with her or in the town where she lived. Gradually, I'm struggling for words. The curfew was lifted, and you could go out in the day, so there was no work. Only the necessary stores were allowed to open. So I didn't have classes to teach, so I went into some of the poorer neighborhoods where there were some Baha'is in the town. I had introduced the faith to some people, and they had become Baha'is, and I'd lost touch with them. I remember one of those days I was in this kind of shanty town, and there was an old man coming to me, and tears were just streaming down his face. And he said, "They've killed Jesus Christ again. They've killed him again," because he really thought that Allende was his friend and was going to change his life for the better. So time goes by. About a month later, 3 weeks maybe, word comes that there was going to be a train going north to the capital. So I went down to the station to get on the train. When it finally pulled in, it was full of people. There were people on the roof. There were people in the stairways getting into the cars. You could see that the cars were jammed full of people. But I was not going to miss this train, so I went down the line of the train until I found an open window, and I asked if they would help me in. And they said they would, so I threw my suitcase in, and they pulled me up the side of the train and in through the window, and I fell across their laps when I came through the window. And I said thank you and excuse me, and they said welcome aboard. The train was so full of people. Normally it was a 3-hour train ride. That day it took 6 hours. I was standing in the aisle for all 6 hours. Getting to the bathroom was interesting. People were packed so tightly that when the train stopped, which it did frequently because there was concern that there were bombs left on the tracks, you'd sort of sway together, but nobody fell down because there was no room to fall down. You were sort of sandwiched in so tightly that nobody could fall down. So it was kind of a relaxing way to travel. We finally got to the Capitol. I walked the 3 or 4 miles to the National Center because there was no public transportation functioning. And I walked through the plaza out front of the presidential palace, and I could see what had happened there. So the palace was a burned out hulk. Almost every inch of the front of the palace had bullet pockmarks on it. All of the buildings around the central square had been damaged by tank fire, bombs, and shrapnel, and small arms fire, machine gun fire. There had been jeeps going through the streets with 50 caliber machine guns on the back, teenagers holding 50 caliber machine guns in the army. The one that really struck me was that sort of off of one corner of the presidential palace was what had been the main post office and telegraph office. And so this was a place that had a sort of a monumental Art Deco entrance that was probably 30 feet high. And in that space, on a normal day, when they were closed for business, there were huge steel and brass gates that had bars in them, and the lower half of the door was solid steel, probably a quarter of an inch thick. Those had taken a direct hit from a tank round. So they were in the back of the recess where this door was, crumpled up like so much tinfoil. It was amazing to see the destructive power. People using the weapons that had been cached in those buildings and in the Sheraton Hotel on the far side of the square had used those weapons to fire down at the soldiers in the square. So the soldiers turned machine guns on them. So there were windows all across the front of those buildings that had gone from being rectangles to circles, where they had just chewed the walls away with machine gun fire to get at the snipers inside. It was just an unbelievable devastation. Across the street from the presidential palace had been a line of flagpoles that were used on ceremonial occasions. They'd put a flag, there must have been 20 of these flagpoles. A number of them had just been shot through and had fallen down, and the rest had bullet holes in them so that they looked like lace. So these steel flagpoles that were probably 6 to 8 inches in diameter had been turned into confetti by the sheer volume of fire that was directed at them or through them towards the presidential palace. There were later stories that Allende had taken an automatic rifle that he'd been given by Fidel Castro and had gone to the front window of the presidential palace himself and had fired at the soldiers outside. And one story, there was never a really reliable story about how he had been killed, but one story was that he'd been shot while he was firing his gun at the soldiers. So I walked through the plaza, and I was able to go the next day up to see your mother, who was fine.
Where was she at that time?
Huh?
Where was she at that time?
She's at home. Everybody was at home.
I mean, in Valparaiso or
She was in Quilpue,
Okay.
outside of Valparaiso, the main seaport, yeah. So I got the last train that went out from Santiago that day. I got to the station and the doors were closing. So I ran up to the doors and pounded on them until the station master opened them. And then he started to talk to me, but I saw the train pulling out. It was already moving. So I ran past him and ran along the platform and jumped up on the last. Yeah, so the last stairway, to get into the last train on the car, I grabbed it and jumped on and went up to see your mom.
How did my grandpa survive? Because he was...
Just kept his head down. He was a communist, yeah, he was or socialist. I guess he was a member of the Socialist Party. He just kept his head down. So we woke up to a new reality. Here's this military junta.
What was that like to, for the leader of the country to be brutally killed? I mean, I can't really imagine that.
Yeah. It is hard to imagine.
And you kind of heard it on the radio, right?
Yeah, we heard his last broadcast before it was cut off. You know, it's hard to know what to think about that. It's what happens when politics goes too far. And it really had. I have thought over and over again in the ensuing years when I think about this, that the military took over at enormous human cost. But they actually did prevent a civil war because both sides were armed to the teeth. Both sides were ready to fight. There was a history of guerrilla warfare dating back to the independence of the country. So it could have been a horrific and catastrophic thing for the country had it descended into civil war. So did the military overplay their hand? Yes, they did. Were they needlessly brutal? Yes, they were. The Chilean military in that sense was not unlike the German army in the Second World War, which was there were people who used the army to give free rein to all of their psychopathic tendencies.
Whether there was a purge afterwards?
Yeah. And there were people who were professional officers who tried to minimize the impact of what they were ordered to do. So it was, and everybody in between. There were both ends of that spectrum and everybody in between. About a year after the coup, there was another teaching team that went through the south of Chile. And we would set up in the main plaza of the town with panels with information on them about the faith. And there were a dozen or so of us traveling, and local Baha'is would help out too. And we'd be there for some number of hours each day, 2 or 3 days in a place. And we'd get permission. One of the guys who went with us had been a martial arts instructor for the police, the carabineros. And so he would go and get permission to set up from the military authorities. And they were spying on us. He later said, I saw one of my erstwhile students on the edge of the crowd. They were just listening. He would, everywhere there was a knot of people, he'd sort of walk over, sidle over, and listen in on what was being said, and then he'd go off to the next group, and pretty soon he'd go back and file his report, and they must have decided that we were harmless enough, so nobody ever interfered with us. But one of those guys who had to give us permission, he was a colonel in the army, and had been a friend of this Baha'i, and he said, I can hardly wait for this to be over, for there to be a civilian government. He said, I didn't join the army for this. I'm not good at this. The army is not good at this. We have to go back to the barracks as soon as we can. This is just not what I signed up for. So there were people who felt that. But right after the coup, again, there were people that you knew who disappeared from one day to the next. There were people that you knew who had managed to smuggle themselves out one way or the other. Sometimes over the mountains into Argentina, sometimes by aircraft or by train. They'd get out of the country. Everywhere you went, on every, especially long-haul bus, if you were going in between cities on a bus, you could expect that there'd be checkpoints. At every checkpoint, soldiers would get on the bus with their machine guns down at their sides and check your identity papers. There were armed soldiers in all the train stations. There was one day your mom came home from the school. The rumor that had gone through the teaching staff was that one of the kids, he was like an 8th grader, had gotten onto a military bus and had shown an ID and was allowed to get on the bus. And they thought they even had informers in the classrooms, which is probably true. So the gun battles continued for a while. I saw one sniper get killed by some soldiers. And right after the coup, I think I've told you this, right after the coup I came back. I'd gone to the market to get food. And I came back to my school, and the secretary was waiting there for me, and her eyes were the size of saucers. She said, "They came looking for you from the police." I said, "You mean the Carabineros?" She said, "No, the secret police." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, you have to go down to it's called the Superintendencia, which is the regional administrative headquarters, where the military had put their guys in each one of those spots in all the major towns. You're supposed to go there right now." And it was clear she kind of thought I wasn't coming back.
Did you think you were coming back?
I just, well, okay, they told me I was stupid. Young, dumb, and immortal. So they said, well, I have to show up. I guess I better show up. It's better that than they come and get me. So I went down there, and they showed me into a room that had a desk, a wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a picture of the new junta on the wall. This is about 10 days after the coup.
It was 3 guys at first?
4.
4?
Yeah, Army, Navy, Air Force, Carabineros, police. But the Army guy was the leader, Pinochet. So they said, wait here. So I waited on a straight-backed wooden chair. And about 10 minutes later, this elegantly dressed guy, obviously from the capital, wearing his expensive overcoat over his shoulders. I mean, this is straight out of a European detective movie or something. Comes in and sits on the other chair. So now he's looking at me. The 2 chairs were in front of the desk. He didn't go behind the desk. I guess there were 3 chairs in the room. And he asked me to see my identification card, and he asked who I was, and he asked why I was there, and so I told him I was there as a Baha'i, and I was teaching English in this Chilean North American Institute. He said, let me see your visa. So I handed him my passport. And he looked at my temporary residence visa that had been bestowed upon me by the Consul General of Chile in Chicago. And he said, are you aware that this is a legal fiction created by the Allende government in order to bring terrorists into the country? And I said, no, I was not aware of that. He said, are you a terrorist? I said, no, I'm really not. I'm a Baha'i. We believe in world unity and world peace, and we believe in obedience to our government. He said, that's good. And I said to myself, it really is good. And he said, I have a suggestion for you. Either leave the country because your visa is now expired and you're illegal, or if you want to stay here, you need to get a permanent residence visa. And if you want to do that, I suggest you go to Santiago tomorrow on the first bus and go to the new seat of government, because since they'd blown up the presidential palace, they took over a multi-story skyscraper that had belonged to the United Nations, and they made that the seat of government. He said, go to this building and apply for a permanent residence visa. So I did that. I took him at his word, and I showed up the next morning. And there were soldiers on both sides of the sidewalk leading up to the gate and inside the gate leading up to the building every 3 to 4 feet. There was a young guy with a machine gun every yard along the way into the building. When you walked into the building, there was a line of people at desks who were there to ask you why you were there. And there was a sort of a suspended landing of the stairway that went up to the next floor. And there were guys with machine guns up there watching. And there were cameras watching everything. So I stated my business, and they gave me a piece of paper that had a timestamp on it. And they said, be sure to get this time stamped, because we'll check the time that you leave here, the time that you leave that office, and the time that you present yourself back here. And if there's a discrepancy, you will have a problem with us. So I took them at their word again. And so I did my business, but it was difficult. They told me to come back in 3 weeks and get my new visa. I had to leave my passport there, which made me nervous. And so it went. I got to be a legally resident member of the Chilean population at that point. So the National Assembly reached out to the junta, and they went and they met with all four of them. I think it was either all four. It might have been the head of the Carabineros. I think it was, actually. They met with the head of the Carabineros. And they gave him the same books that they had given Salvador Allende. And they got a very nice formal letter in response thanking them. The military actually proved to be good friends of the Baha'is, which was unexpected. But they had checked us out. I mean, they had checked us out. Our public events had people in them who reported to the military for at least a year after the junta. I'm sure they did background checks on all the Chilean citizens that they could identify as Baha'is. Certainly the members of the National Assembly, which at that time included your mom, I think.
Did she meet with one of the heads of the...
I don't think so. I don't think she was a member of the group. There were only three, I think, members of the NSA who went to that meeting, and they lived in Santiago, which your mom did not. But, so, for instance, there was an effort... the Catholic Church had identified itself very closely with Allende, and therefore they were decided to be enemies of the military. The military felt that they were not their supporters, and so they used non-Catholic groups to try to dilute the power of the Catholics. So the big evangelical community in Chile suddenly found themselves the new favorites of the military. The military gave them a lot of money for big new churches and all kinds of things. And the Baha'is played a minor role in that. We were non-Catholic, so we were also promoted a bit. We really didn't have much to do with the government, except in one crucial area. The government wanted to have a more even-handed religious education in the country. And they invited representations of all of the different faith communities in the country to submit curricula that could be reviewed and, if accepted, adopted in the public schools as a way of teaching here's religion and here's what it's about. And everybody's was accepted except the Baha'is. And so working with the World Center, we hired local lawyers. At one point, we were working with a niece of Pinochet, who had been a prosecutor and was a highly regarded, very effective lawyer. And she was able to determine that there was a board of experts that had final say over whose curriculum would be accepted and whose would be rejected. And there was one vote by a very sort of old school Catholic priest against the Baha'is, and that was the holdup. So when they realized that it was exactly the kind of partisan or sectarian bias that they were trying to do away with that was the problem, they got this guy off the government removed this fellow from that commission. And he was replaced with somebody else, and our proposal was finally accepted. So they approached us with even-handedness. It was there were aspects. I guess you could call the military at that point enlightened despots. They really did have some of the best interests of the country and at heart, at least some of them. Later, it became corrupted. Pinochet and his family decided that they liked the money and they liked the perks, and the other junta members kind of fell by the wayside because they were not as effective or as powerful as Pinochet was. But among all of their evil things, there were a few things that they did right. So.
So what was the NSA and the Baha'i community doing during all this? How did they manage all this huge transition?
I suppose the quickest answer is just to say they were doing what we're supposed to do, which is that you don't take sides. It was hard, and some people left the faith because of it, or lost their administrative rights, which later they regained. But they were trying. We were trying to ride these rapids, navigate these rapids at a time when there were risks of all over. But we did it by being true to what we believe, that the government is meant to be a source of order and progress in society, and therefore, while we may disagree with one or another policy, the principle of being loyal to the government is something that we stick with. And ultimately, it seems the military government of Chile understood that and treated us with respect as a result. So we went about our business. We were not, unlike other countries, we were not forbidden from having our community meetings. The local assemblies were not disbanded. We got them all properly registered when that became necessary to do. But the government didn't intrude in the functioning of our community, I think because the National Assembly started at the top and made sure that people at different levels in the government, all the local communities went to their mayors, and delegations were sent to the regional, usually generals in the regional superintendents' offices. And we told them who we were and what we believed, and so we made sure that the community made sure that everybody knew that we didn't represent a threat.
How did life change after the coup? Was there food again? Things like that?
The flow of food started almost immediately, which had to be an indication that there were enormous stores being warehoused in various places by various parties of left and right. For a long time, the economic policies of the government were very effective. They were successful in reducing Chile's dependence on copper. So now you can get Chilean grapes and Chilean wine and Chilean blueberries and all kinds of things from Chile, apples that you could never get before. They were never produced in quality or quantity sufficient for export. So the Chilean economy actually prospered. So the Baha'is, having just doing what we do and being concerned about community development and so on, life got easier. There were still Baha'is and family members of Baha'is who had gone overseas to escape the government, who, last time I knew, were still living there, living outside the country, hadn't gone back. But yeah, it became a more normal. It was hard economically. The currency was devalued a few times. At one point, my biweekly paycheck was 1,000,009 pesos. So I was a multimillionaire every 2 weeks. And I'd buy a bag of groceries and maybe some shoes for you, and it was gone. So it was interesting.
Do you have any questions?
No.
So, what did it? It's interesting thinking about how kind of the unofficial word from the World Center is that everything would work out and things would be better in the end. And then, 2 years ago, the first temple in South America was in Chile. So I just wonder, what did that mean to you, or what did that symbolize?
Chile had always had kind of a special place in Baha'i history, I think. Some of the first and most stable organized Baha'i communities were founded in Chile. I forget whether I think the first regional National Assembly in the 50s or the 40s was elected there. And the National Assembly of Chile was one of the first, if not the first, South American National Assembly to be elected. Maybe Brazil came first, I don't know. I suppose there's an argument could be made that the Chilean Baha'is successfully navigated a really difficult time of extreme polarization in their society. And they did it by staying true to the core principles of the faith. So maybe this is partially recognition of that too. If you do the right thing, things work out. Or at least you do your best to do the right thing. And they did.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.